Welcome to Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member.
Welcome to Governance Minutes, sponsored by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, with the support of Corporate Board Member and an NYSE. My name is Ken Bertsch, and we have with us today Shelley Dropkin, Deputy Corporate Secretary and General Counsel Corporate Governance at Citigroup, and Ed Durkin, Director of Corporate Affairs at the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks for having us.
What we're going to do today is a case study in engagement. And the specific issue that we're going to look at, I would characterize as the auditor selection process and how to inspire investor confidence in that process. It has often revolved around the issue of auditor rotation. And Ed Durkin and the Carpenters Union were involved in a shareholder proposal to Citigroup that was eventually withdrawn, and that's what we want to focus on most. So Ed, can you tell us a little about your proposal?
Yeah, at the beginning of the season, we took a look at the audit fees that we're paying, the whole range of fees that were being paid to our big end, our high cap portfolio companies. And in conjunction with what the PCAOB was doing, we for some years have looked at auditor independence as a key issue. Going back 10 years, we had resolutions related to fees and non-audit fees. So it's been an important issue. We think for a long-term investor it makes sense to spend some time on that issue. So we thought that a good way to raise the issue was to put out a non-binding rotation proposal that simply what it asked is for the board to consider, the audit committee and the board to consider adopting a 7-year rotation requirement to see if in fact there was an appetite for that, one with shareholders as well as maybe with audit committee members. So it went to about 30 or so companies, and we had a different series of engagements with companies ranging from no action letters and no discussions to good discussions with companies like Citigroup.
Okay. So Shelley, you got one of these at Citigroup. What happened then?
Well, we typically look at our shareholder proposals and decide if there is an issue on which we can engage. And we've had very successful dialogue with Ed over the years, and so we immediately reached out. The purpose of the engagement is really to understand what the issue is and whether there's anything we are doing or could be doing that would address the concerns that are behind the proposal. And we've found that over the years, with succession planning, for example, there was concern, is anything being done there? Right. The answer was, well, yeah, and they have no way of knowing. So we put disclosure in the proxy statement, and that seems to me to be a very fair way to address it. Sometimes we're not doing something, sometimes we need to improve the practices that we have, and we'll do that. Here, we had an excellent conversation with Ed, and we came to understand that part of the concern was that shareholders had no way of knowing whether the board, the audit committee, were looking at the auditor on an annual basis before making the recommendation and looking at whether they are sufficiently independent and were there any outside concerns, known legal risks, etc. And so once we understood that was the concern, we said, well, let's build something into the proxy statement because we know the audit committee is doing that. In legal, we're a big part of that process. Let's talk about what it is they're doing and put some additional disclosure in the proxy statement. And so we put disclosure in that talks about the whole process that they go through and addresses, we hope, the concern around evaluating their independence, pointing out that the external auditor rotates the lead on the relationship every 5 years, that we look at the known legal risks, we look at the issues, just to say this is what we're doing in the background, and that seemed to me to be a good solution. Okay, it does strike me as a pretty straightforward disclosure, but one that companies have not really been doing.
Yeah, the problem I think with auditor-related disclosure is it's very boilerplate. If you look at the audit committee report, If you look at the ratification vote narrative, there's really no substantive disclosure other than citing, the exchange of information that has to take place between the auditors and the audit firm. So what we were sort of probing at is we challenged companies and we said, look, if you had to defend this resolution, the auditor rotation resolution, in your proxy statement, what would you say against it to give investors confidence that there was processes in place to take care of the independents? And I think that's what Citigroup sort of has begun to put into the proxy statement. It's sort of allaying those fears or giving some, inside look at more than just the boilerplate of what's going on in order to protect that independence.
So you were satisfied with the disclosure?
Well, let me say, we had to be because because the proposal got no action.
Okay.
Not by Citigroup, 7 or 8 companies who will go unnamed, no action, and that was their first move against it. And the SEC unfortunately said it was ordinary business. So what was nice about the exchange with Citigroup is we no longer had, any cards in our hands, so to speak, in sort of negotiating. Right. But I think Citigroup, and we found that going back to majority voting with Shelley, that I think some companies, and Citigroup's one of them, when they see that there's a logic and a rationale to it, they'll embrace it without it being, without us having any leverage. So we appreciated that. Other companies, we had good discussion, but we haven't seen the disclosure yet.
Okay. So, and do you have a set of guidelines for companies? Or
well, what we've done is, because we got no action, we developed a second resolution that was still timely for a lot of companies in the proxy season. Okay. It's a disclosure proposal. Again, there's a group of companies going to the SEC trying to no action it. We don't have a decision as of this date, but we have settled with 8 companies for a list of, it's about 6 or 7 disclosure items that get incorporated into the narrative with the auditor ratification vote, and it builds on, and it's some of the same things that were in the Citigroup. See, the Citigroup was in response to the ratification. Right. These negotiations are in response to the second proposal, which is specifically a disclosure proposal. Right. Okay. So we've got a group of disclosures that 8 companies so far have adopted, and I think it maybe sets the template for something that could be done on a broader scale.
That's great. And how did your audit committee react to all this?
We immediately went back to them and said, this is the proposal that came in. This was the nature of our conversation and the recommendation that came out of it. And they said, okay, draft something, let us have a look. Right. And they were absolutely fine with the disclosure, and we put it in. And we had a subsequent conversation with Ed after the proxy came out, and we talked about additional disclosure that could be in there in following years, and it's something we will raise with the audit committee. Right. As we go, but it's a disclosure is a growing item. It can improve every year. It shouldn't become something where you just put it in and don't change it and don't revisit it. It should be live.
Not just boilerplate.
Not just boilerplate. And I really like having disclosures in the proxy statement that are aimed at informing our shareholders about things that they can't get access to. It was very interesting, around the whole director qualification disclosure. We used to have conversations with people, and they would say, well, the information I get about your directors are those few little bullet points about their bio, and then whether they attend meetings or not. And I don't think that's enough to elect directors. And when the SEC said, give us that more substantive explanation of why, I thought, that's great disclosure. It's hard to write. But if you've done the analysis, it's just put it into the document and tell the shareholders why the board chose these particular candidates. And you should be able to come up with the justifications for all of those folks. I thought it was a wonderful exercise.
So now if you get the sort of Citigroup disclosure at a lot of companies, is that settle the issue? What happens with auditor rotation?
Well, what's interesting with rotation is rotation is arguably a pretty dramatic way to address the independence issue, and disclosure, somebody might argue, is sort of at the other spectrum. But what disclosure does, and whether it's on director qualification issues, this is an area, this auditor independence and the long tenured relationships that are here. If you look at the proxy statements, it's hard to see those long tenured relationships because there's very minimal. There's 2 years disclosure on the fees, and you really sort of, as a shareholder, have to piece it together unless the company tells you what the tenure is, and most of them don't. So But disclosure, I think, will go a long way to addressing the issue here. So I think we have a beginning point with the two resolutions between what Citigroup did and then what the other companies are doing, a starting point. The problem we have is you take an issue like majority voting, and you can do private ordering if you get a single, a single principle, and you say, and then you go out and drive it through resolutions. But disclosure is tough to do through private ordering because every company wants to tweak it a little bit. So our hope is that the corporate community, or some part of it, will embrace the idea of let's talk about the long tenured relationships and why that retention is in the best interest, that continued retention is in the best interest, and then allay the fears about that those relationships could encumber or influence independence. And then I think, we're 90% of the way to solve them. Then shareholders can make decisions.
Right.
You might see the ratification vote actually turn into a consequential vote. I mean, right now it's really not that.
Right.
And maybe that's where this goes, because I think when we talk to the companies, they make, especially the large multinationals, they make a strong case how the cost, when you do the cost-benefit analysis on rotation, it can be problematic. So maybe a disclosure regimen that we build on, and then that ratification vote becomes more consequential, so that if you got a 20% negative vote, then the committee's saying, okay, the shareholders are a little disturbed about this this selection or this retention.
Right.
I think that's will all be a good process going forward.
Okay. So just a moment on engagement generally. Do you try to engage the proponents of any resolution that comes in?
Pretty much every proponent. There are some who do not want to engage, and others who engage not only during proxy season but throughout the year. And I always say to folks, I'm happy to talk or get the right people in the room. We don't only have to do it around proxy season, and it doesn't have to be necessarily around a stockholder proposal. But there are some who are just, they're putting it in, they don't want to have a conversation. I find the dialogues are important. We are not always going to agree. They are not always going to withdraw. We can end up filing no action letters and getting the proposals knocked out. But the first step is to engage and see if there is a common ground. And if there is often a withdrawal. And if there isn't, and there's something better we can do, we try. And sometimes, this is a process over the years.
Sure.
Your practices develop over the years. You may not be able to get everything in the first run. You get the proposal and you say, there's a lot here, but then there's also kind of a gradual coming together, and we've seen that.
You've gotten proposals over a number of years, I think, on political contributions.
We have, and that's also been a kind of a long process where the proponents are looking for, I think, more than we want to do, but we made changes over the years, and we discussed them with not only the proponents, but our institutions and with the proxy advisory firms. And this year was interesting. We got to a point where there's still one piece of it that we're not comfortable doing, but there was a great deal of comfort with the last set of changes we had made, and so we got a great deal of support. And I was very pleased to see that, and that was input from institutions, and it was input from proxy advisory services, as well as input from the proponent. And it was the kind of thing where we went to our nominations committee and we said, look, we think these are good changes. And they said, we're happy to do those things. So that's the way we worked it.
Well, thanks very much, Shelley and Ed. This was a good discussion, and I think a good story of shareholder engagement that's productive for all. We'll be back at the end of May with another edition of Governance Minutes. Thank you.
Join us again next time for Governance Minutes, brought to you by the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals and Knowledge Partner host, Corporate Board Member.